Hi everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Embracing Clinical Trial Technology, the Necessity of Financial Lifecycle Systems. A few logistical items before we get started today. You will receive a copy of today's presentation slides and recording. Our Marketing Director, Lauren Carr, will be following up with everyone who registered for the webinar to make sure you receive those items. As we go along, we encourage you to ask questions along the way. Please address any questions or need for clarification using your GoToWebinar controls, and we will address as many questions as possible at the conclusion of today's webinar. Okay, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. We have Heather Schultz. She's the Senior Vice President of Product Solutions at Clinverse, as well as Tim Immel, Chief Product Officer and Founder at Clinverse. To provide you with a little background, Heather joined Clinverse 3.5 years ago with 16 years of experience in clinical research operations in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and CRO arenas. Prior to Clinverse, Heather was the Senior Director at PPD, which is one of the industry's largest CROs, and focused on innovation-driven performance optimization, project management, and operational execution. Tim has over 20 years of experience in operations and financial management with extensive experience in software development and innovation for business processes, forecasting, and operational system implementation. Prior to founding Clinverse, Tim was the Chief Financial Officer at Nerix Pharma, a specialty biotech company, where he was responsible for all accounting, finance, information systems, and a variety of operational functions. Today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the evolution of clinical trial automation and what is needed in a true end-to-end solution, including the history of technology in clinical trials, the current state, the future of technology in clinical trials, as well as the benefits of a financial lifecycle system, or FLS. For those of you who may not be familiar with Clinverse, we architected the industry's first automated financial management technology solution for the clinical trial space. Powered by our secure technology platform, our solutions standardize clinical trial finance and manage millions of financial transactions globally, including clinical site payments. Used by leading biopharma companies, our clients benefit from reduced workload, time, and costs gained through automation and unprecedented transparency and workflow. With that, I will hand it off to Heather to begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Christy. So first and foremost, I want to start off by saying that we appreciate the level of interest from the audience today regarding this topic. As Christy mentioned, I've spent more than 16 years involved in clinical trial execution, not unlike many of you, covering all aspects of trial operations. In that time that I've spent in operations, it was during a period of significant change in the industry. I think it can be very easy to look at how far we have left to go to create more harmonization across the industry as a whole, but it's also important to appreciate where we've come from. In looking back across the history of the industry, there were many processes that were expected and second nature to all of us. Remember when fax machines were our best friends and e-signatures didn't exist, not to mention manual tracking of all site regulatory documents and versions in multiple spreadsheets. I think we can all insert our favorite example here of how we used to do our work, but today what I really want to highlight is that adopting technology into these everyday activities that we used to perform, while it was potentially and often cumbersome and painful at times, it did create a profound and significant change in the industry as a whole. This evolution of adding technology not only instituted new service areas into the industry, but also changed the face of the skill sets of the personnel needed to execute the work performed across the clinical trial landscape. So when we think back to the days of stuffing envelopes with regulatory documents and filling out shipping labels and shipping NCR paper case report forms back to the office for double data entry, or even mailing red line comments and changes back and forth on contracts and waiting for the original signatures to be returned, and of course that had to be in blue ink, think about how technology changed the face of these everyday processes for all of the involved, including sponsors, CROs, and sites. Even with what was seemingly the smallest of process improvements, there was a profound impact on how we did perform our jobs, but also how adjustments to the simplest of activities impacted the timing and costs related to trial execution as a whole. There were also significant technological advances that occurred. These solutions, such as creating a single sign-on site portal where all documents, training, and information could be received in a standard and consistent format, were introduced. This allowed all participating sites access to information with visibility to sponsors and CROs, subsequently minimizing the initial time it took to create pre-filled documents and mail them to sites. This is just one of many examples, which we'll talk more about, started to open people's eyes to serious process improvement opportunities and efficiency gains that could shorten the trial timelines and lessen the burden for sponsors, CROs, and sites when it came to trial execution. It also opened, as I mentioned earlier, the industry to new and emerging service areas such as specialized study startup groups, among other examples. Technology drove the need to constantly review, adjust, and evolve our organizational structures and skill sets needed to perform the day-to-day tasks in order to stay aligned with the shift in how we approached all of our jobs. More tech-savvy personnel was a compelling background for all team members that were involved in executing clinical trials as we started to implement technology across the board. I think we all agree that technology has greatly benefited the clinical trial industry, and while adopting new ways and means of doing things has sometimes proved slow and painful, it goes without saying that we all manage change in different ways. However, the advancements we have experienced have truly shaped the industry over the past several decades, which is the result of us embracing these types of innovations. Technology and automated solutions, however, still have a richer role to play in our future. So I wanted to take a quick look back at the timeline of clinical trial technology with everyone on the phone today. In the 70s and 80s, the clinical trial technology revolution was in the midst of widespread adoption of something we called interactive voice response systems. The functionality was overlaid on top of old technology and allowed us to specifically enhance the power of the telephone, which was an already common fixture located at every clinical trial site. Through complementing the use of telephones, IVRS was able to assist clinical trial sponsors, CROs, and sites in the randomization of clinical trial subjects, as well as manage clinical supplies. IVRS also gave trial sponsors and CROs a unique perspective and the first real-time view into the status of actual clinical trial enrollment. This allowed for early mitigation planning or strategizing on how to handle enrollment challenges. The next logical evolution for automating the management of clinical trial data took shape in the emergence of what we now call clinical trial management systems, or also known in our acronym heavy industry as CTMS. In the 80s and 90s, CTMS represented a major advancement in the oversight of clinical trials. The use of these systems brought automation to the myriad of study document management elements that were previously tracked using a range of paper files and spreadsheets. The growth of the internet and its availability in the 1990s proved to be transformational for clinical research and specifically for the clinical trial technology area. While databases had been around since the 60s, sites still recorded clinical data on no carbon required, or what we used to refer to as NCR forms, which were manually collected and shipped to a central location for processing. Once they arrived, that information had to be manually tracked and entered into a database with what we used to refer to as double data entry, requiring two different people complete the same task. The teams not only had to manage data entry discrepancies due to the manual entry errors, but they also had to resolve queries and issue those queries to the sites for resolution. This was a process that was manual and proved both time-intensive and expensive. We can all see where this led. It goes without saying it led to the emergence of electronic data capture, which soon became the next clear advancement in clinical trial software. The use of EDC allowed sites to enter data into a proprietary system over the internet. While monitoring was still required, use of EDC eliminated a significant amount of lag time and the availability of having access to real-time data. The use of EDC also opened up more possibilities for real-time decision-making and adaptive approaches to trial execution. With significant efficiencies gained in the handling and cleaning of trial data, it didn't come without some resistance to embracing this type of technology. It took, if you all remember, a significant amount of years for the industry to accept EDC as the new best practice standard, and even a few more years after that to get people comfortable without having their paper. Ultimately, though, EDC made the collection of data easier and less expensive, driving efficiency for sponsors, CRO, and site personnel, which also allowed sponsors to be better equipped and more responsive with increasing SDA requirements, which called for quality of information and more timely awareness of things like SAE reporting. So with all of that background in mind, we're going to turn over to Christy to ask the audience our first polling question. So Christy, I'll let you take that.
Great, thank you, Heather. As Heather mentioned, we've reached the point in the presentation in which we would like to take a quick poll, and I would encourage all of you to participate by clicking on the response that most closely matches your situation. The question is, do you believe the widespread adoption of a financial lifecycle system, or FLS, is necessary, and if so, when? The responses are immediately, 2 to 4 years, greater than 5 years, not necessary, or I don't know what an FLS is. So we'll just take a few seconds here to answer the polling question.
And Christy, while we're collecting the responses, I just want to take a minute to talk about the importance of the question. I think it's important to talk about this with the audience. We've seen a lot of new technologies in the industry, as I was just referring to, over the last several decades, and many of those are now considered standard practice, even though embracing them initially was more comfortable for some than most. So it's important for us to consider where the audience sees or feels financial management falls into this level of importance in terms of it becoming standardized, automated, and expected standard across trials that we conduct even present and into the future.
Okay. Thanks, Heather. And I think our poll results are coming in. It's quite an interesting response and pretty split between immediately 2 to 4 years or not knowing exactly what an FLS system is.
That is interesting, and I think it is not unexpected. I think there's probably 2 schools of thought, one being those that see the immediate need and value and have been part of the dialogue to date, and those that have not had a lot of exposure to financial management through the clinical trial sector, which is what we're going to talk more about today. So that's great. So let me talk a little bit about current state. So interestingly, a recently published report suggests that the technology sector of clinical trials could top $5 billion in the next several years by 2018. This growth obviously comes from an increase in the globalization of clinical trials, increased outsourcing of services, and trial design complexities. But along with this growth, operational changes also take place, such as centralized, remote, and adaptive monitoring strategies, harmonization and standardization of submission data are examples, while the industry continues to focus on ongoing improvements to the technologies that we're currently using. For example, IVRS, as I mentioned earlier, and other technologies of years past continue to pave the way for improved and enhanced versions of those technologies themselves. Things like the movement to IWRS, which is a more web-based interactive approach that can be better positioned to handle the expanding global trial landscape. While there are many significant advances, I think we can all agree that some of them stand out above the rest. So I want to just take a minute to look at the 3 main major advancements in the current technology and illustrate how these have allowed us to keep pace with the volume of trials that we're executing, as well as the demand for trial execution itself. So we already talked about CTMS, the Clinical Trial Management System. This allows the industry to wrap consistency in managing trial-related documentation, site information and other key operational data into a system-supported platform. This also allows sponsors and CROs to maintain key site data, run study-related reports, and house that information in a single centralized record repository. This, as mentioned before, replaced the need to track and maintain study information in spreadsheets, which lacked proper version control and distribution for use within the sponsor and CRO organizations. The other major advancement, and again, we've already touched on it, is EDC and IWRS or IVRS. We've talked a lot about it already, but specifically EDC gave the industry, which many would consider, the most significant technological advance we've seen to date. This allowed sites in any corner of the world to log into a web-based application and enter study-related subject visit data, respond to queries, and give sponsors and CROs more real-time access to site-specific status and progress. One that we also should mention is the significance around electronic data submission. The standardization and control around electronic data submission created a significant efficiency for CRO and sponsor audiences. It allowed the submission of data in a standardized electronic format and offered the ability to proactively plan for conformity and standards that would be expected by the FDA. So I have to kind of ask us all to imagine, when the industry underwent this expansive growth into global trial execution and we experienced increased complexity in trial design and we didn't have these technological advances in place, what would that have looked like? I try to imagine a 300-site global phase 3 trial being spanning across 40 countries and shipping reams of case report form books around the world had our industry not embraced these innovative technology advances. They've allowed us and this industry to stay on pace with the trial execution landscape, yet it's interesting because the data suggests it still takes us longer to execute trials than before. So with that, we're going to go to another polling question because we're interested in what the audience perceives in terms of how we can encourage or motivate sites to pay more attention to trial execution. So Christy, I'll turn this over to you again.
Thanks, Heather. So the question is, will sites pay more attention to trial execution if you pay them monthly and on time? Responses are yes, no, or unsure.
So while that responses to that question are coming in, I just want to also add a little bit of color to this as well. We tend to talk a lot about the time it takes us to start up or conduct a trial, yet we don't often look at what we could do to allow sites with more efficient technology that can create time savings to focus that savings on the actual trial and the results that additional time could impact. Sponsors and CROs, it goes without saying that we often hear through the site channels, site advocacy groups, and site relationships that sites have major hurdles with study execution. We know that several of those hurdles revolve around trial financial management, including timely payments. If we removed the financial challenges, what would be interesting for me would be to understand if this would inspire or motivate a site to pay more attention to trial execution.
With that, I think we're going to close the poll and share the results, which is pretty overwhelmingly responded to. 76%, sorry, say yes, that sites would pay more attention to trial execution.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all. And very consistent with what we're hearing as well with our relationships out in the market and in the industry today as well. So we just spent several minutes talking about the current state of technology in clinical trials and how it helps us today. However, even with all of these improvements, it's interesting because there's still significant areas within clinical development that would benefit from automation and technology solutions. I alluded to this a few minutes ago, and it can be evidenced by looking at the total length of trial development time, which actually has continued to increase specifically for phase 3 trials over the last roughly 15 years. Interestingly enough, the total length of trial development for a phase 3 is now estimated at 6.8 years, which is up from 6 years in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we all know that extending the time to conduct a trial results in additional overall expense to the trial. While technology and other approaches, such as many we've come to become accustomed to, like adaptive protocol design and changes in monitoring approach, are now commonplace discussions and strategies, sponsors and CROs aren't often necessarily seeing the overall cost reduction in trial budgets. While accepted in principle, the introduction of technology to lower cost, improve delivery, and reduce time was and is much more difficult to measure in terms of return on investment when the variables were and are shifting continuously. That shift is related to this complexity and the demands on global trial execution. A perfect example of this is while EDC was being adopted, clinical trials were extending their global reach and increasing complexity. Sites were absolutely critical to the success of trials, but there weren't enough of them. So costs for recruiting new sites, naive sites, training sites, conducting site identification and feasibility were being added to budgets. Even with the best technology in place, finding good sites to recruit the necessary subject populations while keeping up with regulatory submission demands counteracted many of the technology savings that were realized from implementing those solutions. Imagine if that average length and cost of a trial and what that may look like today without these advances. So the 6.8 years, we don't know what it would be, but I can bet that it would be very significant to the overall time to execute a phase 3 clinical trial today. Many believe that this and all of these factors that we've talked about have reached a tipping point, and we now have to embrace technology and innovation with all the partners involved in clinical trial execution in order to streamline clinical trial activity moving forward. A key to using technology and its full value, however, requires widespread adoption of automation to have an impact. And embracing these new technologies is a critical aspect of reaching the next level of trial execution. So herein lies the value of having a technology solution for financial management. When we think about today in the financial life cycle of clinical trials, it touches so many areas. It touches contract and budget negotiation and execution, budgeting and forecasting, site payment generation, site and subject payment management, accounting, accruals, financial reporting for both finance and operations, and it is still greatly dependent on spreadsheets. It's actually a bit shocking that we haven't addressed this up to this point completely. The current process tends to be siloed and manual as well in some organizations, and it's important to make the distinction so that we all understand that the use of spreadsheets, while they're great and they serve a very important purpose, does not equal an automated solution, no matter how sophisticated the formulas or calculations may be. This process is also handled by many different departments that have various touch points in the financial management process. The overall result of this is that it provides limited financial visibility for sponsors, CROs, and sites. Sponsors can't often easily get their hands on the foreseeable funding requirements for the trial. CROs aren't often able to make more frequent payments to sites. This is due to bandwidth and constraints in staffing and personnel. And sites are often left with little detail and visibility into what they've even been paid for in relation to the work performed on a trial. We talk a lot about how operational performance is the key to a successful trial, but all of that is linked to the contractual and financial cost of execution, and we can't overlook that. Sites want accurate and on-time payments for the operational work performed, and sponsors want to know the expense picture of their trial and what that looks like. And CROs want to be able to give their clients real-time options to affect trial outcomes rather than trying to minimize the impact of something that has already taken place. So it goes without saying that everyone has some level of challenge around managing trial financials, and while everyone's challenge might be slightly different, we're all seeking to find a better way to approach the issue and embrace a solution or solutions that will bridge the gap. Tim is going to talk a lot about the future of financial lifecycle management and how it can benefit from the technological advancement. I've actually had the privilege of working with Tim over the past several years, and together our backgrounds have provided us with the understanding and knowledge to work to bring these types of technologies to the forefront. Before I turn it over to Tim, because again, Tim's background and mine complement each other quite well from a financial and operational intersection. But it's interesting because my background being primarily project management and operations, I've had, when I look back, just as many conversations with sites in my project management days around contracts and payments as I did about subject recruitment and enrollment. So I understand how important payments are to sites, as many of us do. But Tim, before I turn it over to you, I'm interested because I had a recent discussion and was asked, why would finance want to pay sites any faster, which made me appreciate, and it seemed to me second nature, but also made me appreciate that different perspective or views of others that may have a more peripheral view of trial management could still be floating out there. So maybe before you jump into talking about the future, you have some insight into that.
Sure. So I've been a CFO for certainly a long period of time, and been in the finance department for multiple decades. And finance sometimes gets labeled with wanting to hold cash, and sometimes it's appropriately labeled. But I can tell you, economically speaking, it costs you money not to pay sites on time. And in some cases, it's significant amounts of money if you don't pay sites on time. And here's why. So only about 7% of clinical trials finish on time. And with the average cost of clinical trials costing about $500,000 per month, a delayed trial becomes very costly. And so I've recently read, and it matched our survey results quite well, that more than 50% of sites say they pay more attention to enrollment on studies that pay monthly. And so holding on to cash and not keeping your sites happy, in my opinion, is a big mistake.
That's interesting, and I think it kind of brings it full circle that, you know, we all have our background, our experience, and our perspective. And, you know, sponsors, CROs, and sites all may share a different perspective, but the goal is one and the same. So thanks for that, Tim.
Yeah, it's important to remember that you cannot perform a clinical trial without a site. You need the site, and you need them focused on your trial. So the future of integrating the financial perspective. So as Heather covered, the industry is experiencing increased time to bring a drug to market. And if you couple that with significantly increasing costs, you wind up with a mixture that industry experts call an industry in crisis. I've also heard this referred to as a business model that is not sustainable. And so looking forward to future efficiencies, which is going to be critical, we need technology that encompasses and takes into account the financial perspective. Now, from a macro level, every planned component of clinical trial execution has a financial impact. So being able to understand the financial impact in advance of a study execution crisis will bring better decision making and a discipline of being proactive. And we know in this industry how we can be reactive. So let's take a look at what's required to incorporate the financial perspective. We need to take into account integration to the record of truth, workflow management for statement of works and site grant budgets. We need the ability to do what-if simulations, so we can do that in advance of starting the trial. And we also, in doing those what-if simulations, need to take into account actual results when we do reforecasting. And then additionally, we need a purpose-built financial management engine to manage transactions These transactions are for financial analytical reporting, transparency reporting, ultimately become a transaction on an invoice to pay your vendor. So now as we discuss incorporating the financial perspective in the slides to follow, we'll also review how the financial data that is most often overlooked will help with planning a trial and playing a key role in trial decision making while adding greater predictability, which is what the industry is certainly looking for. So what is a financial lifecycle system? It is purpose-built software that handles all the global financial aspects of the clinical trial process. So this process begins by automating the budget consolidation and then performing what-if scenario simulations. The budget then becomes the basis for contract negotiation, and whether this contract is a term listed in a statement of work, an SOW, or if it's a term in the site budget, which is part of the clinical trial agreement. Once these are agreed upon, it becomes the basis for future generated financial transactions that are automated by the system. And this automation by the system is performed with a contract translation engine. So the contract translation engine is able to analyze the EDC data, which is the record of truth, or the CTMS data, IWRS data, and other operational data. And upon analyzing the contract terms that were negotiated against that data, it generates a financial transaction once the term has been met. And these financial transactions are managed with internal routing and approval based on companies' SOPs. So it's completely configurable to the way you work. And ultimately, these become payables that are paid to the vendor. And the FLS can facilitate the global payments in over 140 currencies. So its critical financial lifecycle system is purpose-built for global trials. The reporting engine aggregates and accounts for these transactions. So on the accounting side, it facilitates the GAAP accounting that's required for your accruals and your refundables and your payables, especially if you're public. And it facilitates the transparency reporting. Now, the nice aspect is your vendor, through a portal, is able to access all their financial status, and when payments are made, they'll be notified in advance that the payment's on its way with the remittance. Then the data that a financial lifecycle system maintains is now accessible to help you with future budgeting and for reforecasting on the current trials that you're working on. So you start with a budget, it moves to contract, then the contract translation engine analyzes the data against the contract terms, generates financial transactions, allows you to make the payments on a global basis, and you get to use the data for reporting and use it for helping you budget in the future and to reforecast. So let's review an FLS and let's apply it to site payments. Because the concept and the way an FLS works, it's for the total development spend, but let's look at it specifically how it affects site payments. So today, one of the industry issues is the following. More than 50% of the payments made to sites are paid greater than 90 days from work performed. However, sites have to pay their vendors in 30-day net terms. Okay, so it makes sense that the gap in cash is placing sites under financial pressure. So if they're paying their vendors in 30 days and they're not getting paid for performing clinical trials in 90 days or longer, which is typically the case, that's a big gap in cash. So keeping that in mind, it should not be a surprise that there's a large churn in sites conducting clinical trials. And that churn is the primary cause is undisputedly financial related. It's no secret that sites struggle to do basic, accounting or tracking against the study budget. They have limited systems. They lack the ability to be able to bill and receive payments on time. Again, because of limited systems. And so in the U.S., because of this lack of systems, in the U.S., they rely on sponsors and CROs to do this billing for them and to do it accurately and get paid on time. And unfortunately, because of the challenges associated with this, it brings the opportunity for an FLS system to help with the CROs and the sponsors fulfill this for the sites. And it's about 80% of the payments to the sites where the sponsors and the CROs are doing this calculation for them, making the payment. And of course, we know that's not going so well. And using a financial lifecycle system, let's talk about how that's going to eliminate this and the financial burden for the site and give the CROs and the sponsors a tool to be able to manage this. So you first start by creating a project in the system and then begin the budgeting process against the project's a study. And as I mentioned, the budget can be for the total development spend, but in this scenario, we're going to specifically talk about investigator payments, and that's an expense category within your overall budget. And so the first step is to generate a site budget template, and based off of the schedule of assessments, you'll build that template, and you'll use historical data out of the system, and most importantly, develop payment terms that best fit the study. Okay, so now what does that mean, payment terms that best fit the study? With an FLS, any contract term can be developed. And so you can set the objectives of the study and align it with financial terms and have the system manage it. So in one example where study drug was available and it was ready to ship, we've seen contract terms significantly decrease study startup time by paying an administrative fee for expedited CTA signing. So if a site executes the CTA within 30 days, X amount would be paid, and if they execute the CTA after 30 days, Y amount would be paid, so a different amount would be paid. And we've seen that very effectively speed up the time it takes to negotiate a CTA agreement with the site. In another example of a customized payment term for a study, we've seen sites being paid upon data being entered into the system. And now this payment has a holdback. So they're being paid when they enter the data in on case report forms. And the release of the holdback is upon monitoring. So what that does is it facilitates timely data being entered into the system, not being entered in the night before a monitor shows up, and the site gets paid for the work that they're performing, and they're not being penalized if a monitor doesn't show up, because a lot of contract terms say paid upon data being cleaned and monitored. So if the monitor doesn't show up during that month, it's another 30 days that it's going to be before they're paid. When the data is monitored and cleaned, the sites, as I mentioned, that's when they receive that additional money. So you're getting your timely data entered, you're paying the sites, and then it's being monitored, you're getting your clean data, and then you release the holdback. So with the draft budget templates, you'll then be able to run what-if scenarios. So we're still in the budgeting process. You've created the budget, you've created a template, you've customized your terms that are specific for that study, and now you're able to do what-if enrollment simulations against these specific templates that you've tailored. And once you settle on the final site budget templates, you then use them as the basis to begin your negotiation. And once you finalize your negotiation with the sites, with these budget templates, then that becomes the contract, the basis of the contract. So sites do their work in this, so with the budgets being negotiated and they get converted into the contract terms, it goes into the contract module, and now the contract translation engine in the background will analyze the data. So as sites do their work and the system is automatically analyzing this data that the site's entering into the EDC system, it automatically generates the financial transactions automatically for you, and it handles all that complexity. Then the site has the ability through a portal to have visibility into remittances, line item payment details, and what type of payment method. Was it a check? Was it electronic? And it provides them with this near real-time information, which virtually eliminates all payment inquiries. So by eliminating all the payment inquiries, it gives the site the ability to focus on the trial, which is what you want. Now, these paid transactions are then aggregated, which gives you reporting capabilities to perform transparency reporting that is accurate. And what I mean by transparency reporting is in the U.S., that would be the Sunshine Act payment reporting that has to be done. And last September, the CMS reported that 33% of the physician transactions that were reported were incorrect. So 33% of the transactions that reported that for physician payments, 33% were inaccurate and could not be released. Now, to close the loop, the data, this actual data, is then used for analytics, again, to help you budget and reforecast. So the FLS being able to manage the site payments, getting the sites paid on time, sites can truly be focused on clinical trial execution and eliminate the financial burden that sites are currently experiencing. Okay, so now we're going to discuss using an FLS for generating accurate forecasts. During the planning process, financial data, as I previously had mentioned, is overlooked in setting the true expectation of cost and time to enroll subjects. So what does that mean? The typical process for forecasting expense and study duration in today's, without an FLS, is the site, the sponsor or CRO will send out a feasibility survey, and that feasibility survey is used for site selection, and then that becomes the primary tool to estimate enrollment per site, and enrollment is forecasted on a straight line basis, and that straight line basis is over the total estimated enrollment period. So right off the gate, you're starting with a very inaccurate number. Site readiness dates, that's the date that the site can begin enrolling subjects. They're typically not associated with enrollment forecasts, and they're straight-lined over a set duration of time. Okay, so we all know that you can't enroll subjects until you have the site up and running, and yet the forecasts that are being done today are tracking those things completely separate. And the study budget that is compiled is using a standard cost approach per site for startup and ongoing expenses. Okay, so let's take a look at that using an FLS, building a realistic budget and forecast. So our analysis shows that more than 80% of clinical trial costs are associated with the timing of site readiness. Again, that's the date they can start enrolling subjects and subject enrollment. We know subjects can't be enrolled until the site's up and running, and so having a forecasting engine that can use distribution curves for when sites come on board, so forecasting your sites coming on board and then forecasting your subjects, is critical to getting an accurate forecast. We also know that the realistic cost is the total cost associated with the site from startup through closeout. And then that cost is divided by the number of subjects enrolled. So that's your total cost, and it's important that that's analyzed by site experience. Okay, and it's important it's analyzed by site experience because sites that have never performed a trial before, it's going to cost more money for startup, monitoring, advertising, training. So using the standard cost doesn't apply. And then sites that have performed, in excess of, let's say, 10 trials, they're more experienced, it's going to cost you less. Now, what that means is in the budgeting process to be proactive on that and be realistic about your enrollment and the cost of performing that trial, you want to get in front of that and perform more training, perhaps. Okay, so managing the site's clinical trial experience to set realistic costs and enrollment rate to help plan productivity. So it's being in front of it and not being reactive to it. And now you can build your budget around the sophistication of the site, and you can build your templates, your budget templates in accordance to site types and site regions. On the slide, you can see what these distribution curves look like, and by applying these different distribution curves and not doing straight line forecasting, you get a much more significant, accurate budget forecast. And again, you can apply different curves to different sites based on the type of site they are, the region that they're in, and a site's experience. Without an FLS, being able to do these distribution curves and to handle all the variables that are associated with sites that have experience, or the region that the site's in, or the type of site that it is, it's not, with spreadsheets, it's not possible. And an FLS can manage all of those variables and can simply provide the user with a UI to be able to do these simulations and build accurate forecasts. So in conclusion, I just would want to recap again on a financial lifecycle system. It facilitates the budgeting and forecasting. It analyzes the EDC data, so it's taking advantage of your current investments in the technologies that Heather talked about. It conducts global payments in over 140 currencies, provides financial and transparency reporting, and then it uses this data to help you forecast and budget for the future.
Thank you, Tim. We wanted to kind of go back to the first polling question. We thought it would be interesting to revisit the same question to see if your answer had changed. So we're just going to do one last quick poll and ask the same question. Do you believe the widespread adoption of a financial lifecycle system is necessary? And if so, when? So immediately, 2 to 4 years, over 5 years, not necessary, or you still do not know what an FLS is? So let's give a few seconds to gather responses and see if anyone's answer changed. Okay, let's close the poll. Okay, well, it looks like it was a pretty dramatic change. We went to 76% of you saying that there was an immediate need to adopt an FLS system. So that's pretty good. Tim, do you have any response to that, or Heather?
I think that is it's encouraging, and I'm happy to see that level of response based on the topic we covered today. And specifically, I think, and we agree, that this is the next foray into technological advance we need to see in this industry. Everything we do and every component of execution is related to financials, and it has been largely put on the back burner for many decades to focus on what is, primarily the expense of running a trial is the clinical monitoring, site execution, and data management aspects. So I think it's long overdue, and like I said, encouraging to see the audience would agree that it needs some immediate attention.
Great. Thank you, Heather, for that. Next steps, we hope you have found the information valuable from today's presentation. And as mentioned earlier in the presentation, a copy of the slide deck and the webinar recording, as well as an associated white paper, will be sent to you in the next couple of weeks. But we'd like to take any questions if any of you have any. If you haven't already, please submit your questions and discussion points in your GoToWebinar controls, and we will try our best to answer as many of them as we can.
So I see one question that's come in, and it says, if the sponsor or CRO is using the FLS, how does this remove the burden from the site related to financial management?
That's a good one. Tim, I'll start with that one, so you can look for others if there's other questions out there. But for me, I'd like to take this from an operational perspective, and Tim maybe can comment from a financial perspective after I go through some of my thoughts. So initially, the thoughts that jump out at me is that I see the use of any FLS system resulting in a reduction of the burden to the site. Right now, what I can only imagine is that sites struggle with clearly understanding what they've been paid for in some cases. So they receive a payment with limited detail, no descriptions for which subjects, visits, procedures, and other fees, etc. I think providing transparency around those details and in a downloadable format that they can keep and maintain, so they don't have to create and maintain their own spreadsheets as well, because that's another facet. We talked a lot about spreadsheets, but sites also have to create and use their own spreadsheets for tracking subject and visit-related payments. So that, in and of itself, reduces an extreme amount of administrative burden, I believe, to the site. In addition to that, individual site tracking tools and reconciliation efforts that the site may have to put in at the end of the trial to confirm what they've been paid for, to true up any pending accruals that are owed to them for work performed, is a significant amount of staff time. I'm not sure specifically how much staff time, but I can imagine it would be rather significant. So right out of the gate, I see this as a huge advantage from an administrative standpoint to the site, minimizing individual spreadsheet creation, minimizing reconciliation efforts, individual tracking efforts on a site basis across the studies that you run, because you're likely running, again, more than one study, so you repeat this exercise for maybe the 6 or 8 studies that your institution or your center is running at a given time. So that's where I see it from an operational perspective. And Tim, again, you might see something you want to add from a finance view.
Sure. So when I was a CFO at the biotech company, we had a trial where payments, we struggled. We struggled getting sites paid. And the site started calling in, and they were very upset, and they were very frustrated. And so I saw it firsthand how distracting the financial burden and the lack of site payments can be to a site. And you want them focused on the trial. And surprisingly, not actually, but the trial was delayed. And it was actually delayed over a long period of time. So when I talked about it's important to get sites paid on time, and it's very, very costly if they're not focused on the trial and your trial is delayed. Again, I experienced that firsthand, and that's one of the reasons for founding Clinverse. in developing a financial lifecycle system is to be able to manage it from an end-to-end process of budget management, contract negotiation, and payment, and relieving the burden from the site so the site doesn't have to focus on the payments and track all of that in Excel and have the struggles that they have today.
Yeah. So, Jim, I see another question that popped up that kind of piggybacks off what you were saying, and perhaps you can take a crack at this one as well. But the question is, could this application be utilized within an academic institution and not just for industry? And I know the answer to that, but I'll put that in front of you unless you'd like me to start with that one.
Go ahead and start.
Yeah, okay, great. So I think it goes without saying that this is a tool that, regardless of where the contract or budget initiates from, this type of tool can manage any type of contract term that would be put into the system. So what do I mean by that? If it's a physician-run study, if it's an academic institution, the similar process is still followed in terms of developing a budget, developing a contract, and budget to execute that work. And managing those terms is what a system like this should and can do. So it isn't specifically for pharma or for CROs, but it absolutely can be utilized for large and small physician-driven studies, academic-driven studies, as well as, you know, the largest biotechs or biopharmas out there. So it should have that flexibility. It should be able to be configured and easily used on any type of study to manage these types of financial aspects that we've been talking about. So I absolutely would say yes, it can be utilized in an academic platform as well as industry.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Heather. The item there is getting access to the data, which all sites have access to the data. Not sure if they receive it, but being able to take that operational data and analyze it against the contracts, because the system, again, does that automatically for you to generate those financial transactions for invoicing. And it's flexible enough. I'm going to roll this into another question here, where it says, does Clinverse sync payment information to an accounting software system? So the system's flexible enough to be able to be configured to do your accounting. So a CRO's accounting is different than a site or an institution site's accounting, which is different than a sponsor's accounting. And the system is flexible enough to be able to map to your chart of accounts and your GL and perform the accounting in accordance to the way you do it today and integrate into your financial ERP system.
Great. Well, I think that is all the time we have for today, and we apologize if we weren't able to get to everyone's question, but please stay on the lookout for our blog post. We'll be posting answers to other questions on the Clinverse blog, so look for those. And thank you for your time today, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.